They were laughing before I even understood what was happening, like real laughter, not the polite kind, but that sharp, cutting sound you hear when people think they're safe to be cruel. And I still remember standing there in that courtroom watching a grown man struggle to pronounce a single word, subdivision, like it was something simple, something ordinary, and one woman behind me leaned over and whispered, "What is he even doing here?" And another one actually said, "I think he's the gardener," like it was a joke, like the room belonged to them. But what nobody knew in that moment, what nobody in that polished little courtroom with their folded arms and expensive coffee realized, was that everything they thought they understood was about to collapse in a way none of them were ready for, because the man they were laughing at was Miguel Santos, and his life had been built on things none of them ever bothered to notice. Miguel had lived in Cedar Hollow Estates for 18 years, Unit 7B tucked near the back where the fence line met the old oak trees, the kind of place people only notice when something goes wrong. And Miguel wasn't the kind of person who ever made noise about anything. He wasn't loud. He wasn't political. He didn't go to HOA meetings unless he absolutely had to. He just worked, day after day, landscaping under the sun with hands that always smelled like soil and fertilizer. Then at night cleaning office buildings downtown where the lights stayed on long after everyone else had gone home. And when people passed him in the neighborhood, they barely registered him. Just another quiet man trimming hedges, mowing lawns, fixing gutters after storms, the kind of person who keeps everything together without ever being seen for it. And that's how it had always been, until the leadership changed at Cedar Hollow, until a man named Brad Whitmore became HOA president. Brad was the kind of guy who walked like every room was already his, polo shirts, tucked in too tight, sunglasses even when there was no sun, always talking like he was delivering verdicts instead of opinions, and at first people thought he'd just be organized. One of those guys who likes rules too much, but it didn't take long before organized turned into controlling, and controlling turned into personal. And somehow the first target wasn't a big issue or a safety concern, it was Miguel's backyard greenhouse. A small structure he built quietly over a weekend. Nothing fancy. Just a frame with transparent panels and a little solar ventilation fan humming softly during hot afternoons. He built it for his youngest daughter, Sophia, who had severe asthma, the kind where hospital visits weren't rare and inhalers were just part of daily life. And Miguel wasn't trying to make a statement. He was just trying to help her breathe easier, grow some clean vegetables, create a little pocket of healthier air behind their home. Something small, but meaningful. But Brad Whitmore didn't see it that way. He saw noncompliance. He saw visual inconsistency. He saw something that didn't fit his perfect brochure version of the neighborhood. And so the letter came, folded neatly like it was nothing personal. Tear it down or pay $9,200 in fines. And Miguel remembered standing in his kitchen reading it 3 times because it didn't feel real. Like how could something so harmless suddenly become a violation? Sophia was sitting at the table coloring, humming softly with her inhaler next to her crayons. And Miguel didn't even want to tell her at first. But kids notice everything. She looked up and said, "Are they mad about my plants?" And that question hit harder than anything else. So Miguel did what he always did. He tried to fix it the quiet way. He went to the HOA office after work still in his dusty uniform, holding a folder tied with string. Inside were permits from years ago, approvals signed before Brad ever showed up, documents that clearly allowed small backyard structures within certain limits. But when he tried to explain it, Brad barely looked up, just leaned back in his chair like Miguel was wasting his afternoon, and said something like, "Rules change, Mr. Santos. Maybe you missed the update." Like it was nothing, like history could just be overwritten by attitude, and the fines kept stacking, warning after warning, until finally a court notice arrived. And that's when everything shifted. Because Miguel didn't hire a lawyer, he couldn't afford one. Instead, he showed up with that same worn folder and Sophia holding his hand in a dress she picked herself because she said she wanted to look brave. And I remember thinking how wrong it felt that a child had to prepare herself for something like that. The courthouse itself felt colder than it should have, like the air conditioning was designed to make people feel small. Brad was already there when we arrived, sitting at the front, like he owned the place, arms crossed, confident smile. Whispering to someone from the HOA board like this was already decided, and I heard him say, "This guy doesn't even understand how communities work," like Miguel was some outsider who had wandered into the wrong system. And then the courtroom was called to order. and everything went quiet in that heavy, expectant way where even breathing feels loud. Judge Evelyn Hart walked in, calm presence, no wasted movement, the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. She glanced at the files, then at Miguel, then at Brad, and I noticed something shift in her expression, not judgment yet, just attention, real attention, and she asked Miguel first if he understood the charges, and he stood there for a second, cleared his throat, and said in careful English, "My English not perfect, but my papers are." And then he opened the folder like it weighed more than paper should. And I still remember the exact sound of the room when he pulled out the first document, because it wasn't loud. It was worse, it was silence, and Brad leaned forward slightly like he was about to take control of the moment, like he always did, but the judge raised her hand just slightly, not dramatic, just enough to stop him before he even started, and she said she wanted to see something, the original approval for the structure. And Miguel placed it on the desk with both hands like he was afraid it might disappear. And for the first time I saw Brad's expression change just a little, not panic yet, but something close, something uncertain, because the paper Miguel handed over wasn't just a request or a complaint. It was a signed approval from years ago, clear, official, stamped, and the judge picked it up slowly, reading line by line, and the room felt like it was holding its breath. Sophia squeezed her father's hand tighter, and Miguel didn't move at all, just stared forward like he was waiting for something he couldn't name. And that's where everything began to tilt, right at the moment when everyone in that room realized this wasn't going to be the simple case they expected, and Judge Hart looked up at Brad Whitmore and asked a question that changed the entire temperature of the courtroom. "Mr. Whitmore, is this your signature?" And Brad adjusted his collar like the air suddenly got harder to breathe. And he said something that sounded confident on the surface, but didn't quite land the way he wanted it to. And in that moment, I knew we were no longer in the world of assumptions and jokes. We were somewhere else entirely, somewhere real, and the judge leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to signal that whatever came next was going to matter a lot more than anyone had prepared for. And Miguel just stood there, still holding his daughter's hand, waiting for the truth to finally catch up with all the noise around him. And that's where this story really begins to turn. Started differently than anyone expected, not with shouting or drama, but with paperwork, because that's what real power usually looks like when it finally shows itself, quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore once it's placed under the right light. And I remember Judge Hart slowly setting the document back on the desk like she was making sure everyone in the room had time to understand what they were looking at, not just see it, but understand it, because it wasn't just an approval letter. It was a legally binding HOA authorization from 8 years earlier, clearly stating that small auxiliary garden structures were permitted within Miguel Santos' lot boundaries as long as they met safety and setback requirements. And it had been signed by Brad Whitmore's predecessor, which meant everything the current HOA had been doing to Miguel wasn't just harsh, it was potentially unlawful. And the room that had been so comfortable with laughter earlier now felt tighter. Like the walls had moved in a few inches while nobody was looking. Brad shifted in his seat, trying to reclaim control the way people like him usually do, by speaking first, louder, faster, more certain, and he said something like, "Your Honor, that document is outdated. We updated community standards for aesthetic consistency." And I swear there was a moment where you could feel half the room almost nodding along with him out of habit, because that's how authority works in places like that. People assume confidence equals correctness, but Judge Hart didn't even look impressed. She just asked, calmly, "Was this approval ever formally revoked?" And that question did something subtle but devastating, because Brad hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice, and then said, "No, but it was superseded by policy." And the judge leaned forward slightly, and I still remember the way her pen stopped moving, because that's when the tone shifted from review to scrutiny. And she said, "Policy does not supersede contractual approval unless proper legal procedure is followed." And suddenly the word procedure felt heavier than anything else in the room. Miguel was still standing there, holding Sophia's hand, and she was looking around like she didn't fully understand why everyone had gone so quiet. But she could feel it. Kids always can. The shift in energy when adults stop pretending. And then the judge asked to see the HOA meeting records where the new rules were adopted. And that's when the first crack appeared in Brad's confidence, because he didn't have them ready, or maybe he didn't have them at all. Instead, there were excuses, mentions of informal board consensus, references to ongoing updates, phrases that sound official until someone actually asks for proof. And the judge wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. She just kept asking precise questions that forced everything into clarity. And the more she asked, the more the story started to unravel. Because it turned out Miguel wasn't the only one affected. There were notes in the file about other residents who had received similar fines for minor visual violations. Things like shed paint color, fence height variations, even plant placement near property lines. All selectively enforced, always inconsistent. And that's when I saw something I didn't expect, not anger first, but realization spreading across the courtroom, like people were suddenly re-evaluating things they had accepted without thinking. And one of the HOA board members behind Brad leaned forward and whispered something to another, something I couldn't hear, but the expression said enough. And then Judge Hart did something that shifted the entire weight of the case again. She asked Miguel to explain why he built the greenhouse. And for the first time in the entire hearing, he wasn't just responding to accusations. He was speaking for himself. And he looked down for a second, then said quietly, "For my daughter." And his voice wasn't strong, but it was steady, and he explained Sophia's asthma, the hospital visits, the nights she couldn't breathe properly, how the greenhouse wasn't about decoration or breaking rules. It was about creating cleaner air and growing food she could actually tolerate without triggering reactions. And as he spoke, Sophia squeezed his hand again, and I saw Brad glance over, just briefly, like he hadn't fully processed that part of the story before, because in his version this was about compliance, but in Miguel's version it was about survival, and those two versions don't sit comfortably together in the same room. And then came the moment that changed everything, because the judge turned back to the HOA records again and said she was placing the fines under immediate review for potential retaliatory enforcement. And when she used that word, retaliatory, it landed like a hammer, because it implied intent, not mistake, not misunderstanding, but purpose. And Brad finally tried to interrupt, saying, "This is standard enforcement, Your Honor. We maintain neighborhood integrity." But his voice didn't have the same confidence anymore. It was slightly sharper, slightly defensive, and Judge Hart stopped him mid-sentence, not rudely, just firmly, and said, "Integrity is not the same as selective punishment." And the room went completely still again. And then she did something even more unexpected. She looked at Sophia, not as evidence, not as background detail, but as a child sitting through something she should never have had to sit through. And she asked Miguel if Sophia's condition was documented. And when he handed over medical papers, she didn't just glance at them. She read them carefully. And I remember thinking that was the first time anyone in that room had looked at Miguel's life outside of the HOA file. And when she finished reading, she leaned back and said the fines were now suspended pending full investigation, and that the HOA would be required to provide full transparency on enforcement practices over the past 5 years. And that's when Brad's posture changed completely, not dramatically, but in a way you only notice if you're watching closely. The way people sit when they realize they are no longer guiding the outcome. They are inside it. And I could feel the shift in the room too, like the laughter from earlier had evaporated and left something heavier behind, something closer to accountability. And Miguel didn't react much. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just exhaled slowly, like someone who had been holding his breath for a very long time without realizing it. And Sophia looked up at him and whispered, "Are we okay?" And he nodded, not because everything was solved, but because something had finally stopped hurting in real time. And that's where the second part of this story ends, not with victory, not yet, but with the first real crack in a system that had been confident it would never be questioned. And in the silence that followed, you could almost feel everyone waiting for what would happen next. Didn't feel like a courtroom anymore, not in the way it had at the beginning. Because once the surface broke, once the questions started landing in the right places, everything started to feel less like a hearing and more like exposure, like something hidden in plain sight finally being pulled into daylight. And I remember the judge returning after a short recess with a different kind of silence in the room, not the tense silence of uncertainty, but the heavy silence of people who already know the direction things are going. They just haven't heard it officially yet. Miguel was still standing in the same place, Sophia still holding his hand, but something in him had changed, not because he had won anything yet, but because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't being dismissed. And that alone seemed to change the way he carried himself. Quieter still, but steadier. And Brad Whitmore looked different too. Not loud anymore, not confident, just contained, like someone trying to hold a door shut from the wrong side. And Judge Hart opened with a simple statement that cut through everything. She said the HOA had failed to produce complete records of enforcement decisions, failed to justify selective fines, and failed to demonstrate lawful procedure for the updated uniformity standards. And each failed. Didn't need emphasis, because repetition did the work on its own. And then she paused, and what came next wasn't loud, but it was final in a way that made people straighten up without realizing it. She said, "The court finds sufficient evidence to support retaliatory and discriminatory enforcement practices by the Cedar Hollow Estates HOA." And for a second, there was no reaction, like the room hadn't fully processed that a community institution was being labeled that directly in a legal setting. And then she continued, ordering the immediate cancellation of all fines issued to Miguel Santos, restoration of any payments already collected, and a mandatory review of all HOA enforcement actions under county oversight. And that's when the reality hit Brad fully, because it wasn't just about Miguel anymore. It was about authority, control, and whether the HOA had been acting within the law at all. And he finally stood up, trying one last time, saying something about protecting property values and community standards, but his voice didn't carry the same weight. It sounded like something rehearsed for a room that was no longer listening the same way. And Judge Hart didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just said, "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." And he did. And that small moment somehow felt heavier than everything that came before it. Because power doesn't always fall apart loudly. Sometimes it just stops working in real time while everyone watches. And when the final order was read, requiring written apology to Miguel Santos, immediate suspension of HOA enforcement authority pending audit, and submission of governance records to county regulators, there was no applause, no celebration, just a long stillness, like the room was trying to understand what came after a system loses credibility in front of itself. And Miguel didn't move for a moment, like he was waiting for someone to tell him it was still not real. And then Sophia tugged his hand slightly and said softly, "Does this mean they stop hurting us?" And Miguel looked down at her for a long second before answering, not with victory, not with pride, just with honesty. "Yes, I think it does." And outside the courthouse the air felt different, like it had space in it again, and a woman approached them hesitantly, the same one who had been whispering earlier, and she looked ashamed in a quiet way, not dramatic, just real. And she said she was sorry, that she had assumed things that she never knew about Sophia, and she thanked Miguel for what he had done, even though he didn't feel like he had done anything except show up. And Miguel just nodded politely because people like him don't usually know what to do with apologies that arrive late. And later as they walked toward the parking lot, Sophia asked if she could still keep her plants in the greenhouse, and Miguel smiled for the first time that day, small and tired and real, and said, "Of course." And in that moment the story wasn't about HOA rules or court rulings anymore. It was about a small space behind a house where a child could breathe a little easier. And maybe that was always the point, even if nobody else saw it until it was almost taken away. And as for Brad Whitmore, there was no dramatic ending for him, no shouting scene. Just a man standing alone in a hallway while paperwork moved past him like he had become irrelevant to the system he once controlled. And that's usually how these things end in real life. Not with explosions, but with quiet consequences that arrive long after the confidence is gone. And maybe the question this story leaves behind isn't who won or lost, but how. Many times people like Miguel are dismissed before someone finally looks at the paperwork instead of the stereotype. And whether we recognize those moments while they're still happening or only after it's too late. And if this story made you think even a little differently about what respect really means, or what fairness looks like when no one is paying attention, then I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this don't end in courtrooms. They continue in conversations like the one we're having right now. So tell me in the comments what you think was the real turning point. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you want more real feeling stories like this one.